You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, greetings, everyone. This is Doug Thorpe, and you're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense. We're the show where we try to take all of the craziness and ambiguity and wild things going on in the business world, especially in respect to leadership skill and ability, and break it down into some common sense, sort of bite-sized learning to understand and help you as a leader do more with your people and the teams you have. Today, I've got a gentleman named Dan Frayling. Dan is going to share with us some ideas about career progression and particularly some thoughts on the millennial population. We'll get into that in more detail, but first let me say, Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Doug.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a bit of a custom here, Dan, to ask the guests to give us a little bit of a backstory on how you got to where it is you are today and what inspires you to do the things you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in the leadership development space for about 10 years now. And part of that experience was in seeing all different types of leadership development interventions. So, from anything from training to even organizational development, working with teams, to being able to oversee a coaching program. And I kept finding myself drawn to coaching as a really effective development intervention, and then started to work on getting my own coaching training and starting working with clients in that space. So pursued an MBA, master's in organizational leadership, worked in these leadership development projects, and then worked with my own coaching clients. And I've recently gone full into the coaching, and I'm excited to be in that space now.
Very good. Very good. Well, coming out of that world, listeners to this show have heard me say this before. We have a weird and somewhat, it's mentally wrong tradition in the business world. We look out on our shop floors and in our networks and we say we need a leader for this team. And we inevitably tap on the shoulder of the person that's our best contributor, the highest performer, the smartest engineer, the best sales guy. And we go, poof, you're now the supervisor of this team. And thus, by definition, begins a leadership journey, but yet the individual doesn't necessarily know that. A lot of times, they're put in that role in a kind of a trial and error, sink or swim, baptism by fire, or whatever you want to call it, to go figure it out. And the continued neurotic angle to that is if they make it, if they succeed in that entry level manager job, they get promoted. They get promoted to be manager of something bigger, and so it goes 2 or 3 iterations, and then finally, again, the tradition generally leans to the idea that after about that third promotion, you might get qualified to go to a leadership development program. Mm-hmm. Well, kind of late, don't you think? So that maybe is leading the witness, but what's your experience along that line?
No, I think you're spot on with all of that, and I think it's really helpful to view career advancement and leadership as two separate but related areas. That's a lot of what this book that I wrote is this idea that it's not just being better at your job as an individual contributor qualifies you to then lead others. It's a distinct skill set. And being able to really strategically decide if you're ready for leadership, if you want to take on leadership, there's nothing wrong with pursuing just expertise and not going into a full leadership role. So I think there's that element of it too, is like, why do you want to be a leader and how are you developing yourself as a leader? And then the other point that you touched on, I think, is also spot on earlier leadership development interventions making a ton of sense so that people can start off with the right habits, with the right frameworks, with really understanding how to go about developing as a leader rather than coming in just at, okay, you're already a leader and we're trying to fix something that's already gone wrong.
When you had a hand at helping the companies you worked for with putting these programs together, what were some of the considerations or the maybe trigger points in who got in the program, who didn't, that sort of thing?
Yeah, another great question. So I think I was lucky enough to work in some forward-looking organizations that were really focused on leadership at all levels, and this idea that it's not just executives who are leading, it's people all throughout the organization. And even if you're not in an explicit management or supervisory role, that's still leadership. So I was lucky enough to be in environments that really supported that approach of that leadership at all levels. I know that's not the case everywhere, for sure, and that it's often focused on just at the highest levels and trying to sort of fix and massage people who are already set in different leadership ways into a different way of thinking, which has its place. But I think it's much more instructive to have this throughout, and then even to have more specific targeted leadership development programs and interventions throughout, coaching throughout.
Well, just curious, what were some of the key elements that these programs attempted to address?
Yeah, so I think it's really the ones that I had a hand in overseeing and helping out with and facilitating portions of were really transformational leadership based. So a lot of that kind of a leadership philosophy of how do you as a leader help people go beyond just, how do I transactionally get the most output and results out of them, and how do I help them develop into leaders of their own. And I think that's something that's really important. I think the coaching in my mind is where you see the real difference in growing leaders is that you get to work with people one-on-one or in even group settings, but really one-on-one for the most part in the specific leadership challenges they're facing, the specific leadership opportunities they're facing. And I found that to be even more effective because you can take it a little bit down from the theory and the sort of broad group perspective and into, okay, how is this really going to be something that's going to make you a better leader, make you a better manager, something you can apply to your team, something that fits in with your own career aspirations and the impact you want to be making.
So, folks, if you're playing along with us and you have your buzzword bingo card handy, we dropped one of those buzzwords just now: transformational leadership. That's a great moniker that has been kicked around in a lot of circles that I certainly travel in. Dan, break that down for us. What did you guys typically really consider what it meant to be truly a transformational leader?
Yeah, so there's all kinds of elements to transformational leadership, and there's some specific frameworks that have the exact ones that particular training references. I think in general, it's the idea that you're going away from this transactional approach to leadership, where it's I'm going to want this from you. Can you give me that? And it's that carrot and stick kind of old school mentality, and it's going into the, how do I show up as a leader to inspire others? How do I ensure that I'm growing them as a leader themselves? How do I make sure that we're working toward a common vision and common goals, and that everyone is growing and transforming as a leader as a result of this process? So it's really that idea that it's less of the supervising and managing to get a desired outcome, and it's more of how am I growing others to also be developing themselves along this journey.
I was taught a simple explanation of the difference between management and leadership, and I've used it ever since I first learned it a number of years ago, and it goes like this. Management is about process, and leadership is about people. And I think the management mindset is what gets you into that transactional execution. Okay, what's our quota for the day? What's our budget for the month? We spend a lot of time, and it's definitely appropriate for the success of the business to address that and achieve those levels of success. But when it comes to long-term continuity for the business, the expansion and growth of the culture that can support the brand you want to have, you've got to get into the people side of things. It's just an inevitable, undeniable requirement. And that's where the argument stands for creating leaders, not just managers.
It's so true. And I think especially now as we're getting into this increasingly changing and volatile world that you mentioned in the intro, that it's a lot of the sort of easy process-oriented management solutions have been done to a large degree. And they're obviously still important, and you still need to be efficient in achieving these results and metrics and all that. But the way to do it now is much more through leadership of people, and for looking for solutions that you don't yet already know the answer to as a boss at an organization, but you're actually trying to get people to look toward the future, come up with their new ideas, new approaches to yet unforeseen challenges or yet unresolved challenges. That leadership focus, that focus on people is just increasingly important.
Well, and that's a great segue into probably what's going to be the remainder of this show, the whole idea of the people side of things. We are hearing, seeing, and feeling the impacts of the post-COVID environment and what it did to the mindset among workers in the employment pool. I think everybody agrees that people started showing up with a different attitude about work. And many have argued, some studies have already been done about the possibility that the COVID experience actually did drive this seismic shift in the way work is going to be valued by people in general. And therefore, they're showing up with different expectations, different standards and beliefs about performance. Their own sense of expectation and obligation has shifted. So leaders are kind of spinning right now, trying to reevaluate and create answers and programs to support the new mindset. So that's a lot said, but what are you seeing on that front?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think COVID was this big reset point and a tipping point for a lot of these trends that have been building for quite a while now. I tend to not buy into the sort of extreme hype on either side of this, the quiet quitting phenomenon that's out there of this, I'm only going to work exactly as much as is required and try to do as little as possible. I think that's a recipe for disaster as an employee, as someone who cares about an organization. On the other side, I think there's this hustle and grind kind of mindset of, the more, if you can sleep overnight in the office in a sleeping bag, that's great leadership. I think that's also way off base. And the truth lies in the middle of, how do you both value and respect the people in your organization, and how do you ensure that everyone is pulling toward common goals that make sense and have a purpose and have a value to them? I think it's that synergy and balance there of doing both, of caring about people and about purpose and mission and objectives and goals. That's the key.
Well, immediately related to that, when we do start talking about the people, the other thing that emerges is the recognition of the diversity in the workplace, starting with, the generational bands that, again, data tells us that we have more different generations represented in the workforce now than we've ever had. And that puts an extra burden on managers to try to figure out, how do I address the needs of each segment? So let me just stop there and ask you, what are some of your observations about the dynamic that is emerging?
Yeah, so I think we're at a really interesting phase, as you've pointed out, of the baby boomer generation is now tends to be in late career. Some are moving into retirement. Gen X is now moving into the sort of senior leadership executive roles to a large degree. Millennials are my generation, the generation I tend to work the most with as coaching clients. And we're now at this very interesting phase of being in that sort of high potential mid-level rising leader camp. So millennials are now 27 to 42, I think, by most definitions. So it's really that, they're already in proven leadership roles and they're in the leadership bench and pipeline for organizations. And then we have another interesting dynamic with Gen Z coming in, and they're now entering the workforce. They're in their early 20s and they're coming in with their own ways of working. So I think there's all kinds of different stereotypes about each of the generations that's worth knowing, and it's worth knowing about how they view generally work and how they generally view leadership. And then I think the key is to figure out, how do I not let this divide my approach to leadership and management, but how do I try to partner with people in each generation, treat them as individuals with their own goals and needs and wants and desires, and not stereotype across just, okay, everyone in the baby boomer generation is this, or everyone in the millennial generation is this.
Well, I agree with you. I think the smartest approach that a leader can take is to not try to allow the definitional boundaries to create ring fences around each population and somehow think of them so radically different that you almost come to the conclusion, I can't deal with it. And I've sadly heard that occasionally. It's interesting to me, as I started studying this phenomenon, I was pointed to a writing that I've actually used in keynotes where I've read from the text, and I'll ask the audience, who wrote this? Where did this come from? And unilaterally, people say that's the Millennial Manifesto. That's the statement of the millennial mindset. That's a wonderful summation of it. Where'd you get that? That's amazing. I need to have that. Well, it was written by Henry David Thoreau in 1863. And I love discovering it, and specifically, it's some text out of his famous book Walden Pond, and but it points to the thinking that generationally, generation over generation, it's no different. This has been going on for decades, if not centuries, where a new generation springs up. They mature and they move into positions of authority, so they assert their values and their views of the world, and everybody else kind of has to deal with it, but to be I think a prudent and effective leader, it's that deal with it part that's important. And rather than look at it as something negative, look at it as a positive and ask yourself, what can I learn from this guy or this lady? What value are they bringing to my organization? And let's circle together and, row in the same direction.
I love that story. It's funny. I'm actually in the Boston area, so we're not terribly far from Walden Ponds. And it's so true. These are some timeless issues at play here, and I think it is exactly that. It's how do we be on the same team, be part of the same organization, be working toward the same goals, and embrace the various strengths that each person and each generation, I guess, at the broader sense, brings to this. But it's less of that. How can I complain about X group, and how can I really embrace what they're saying and incorporate it into my worldview?
So as a coach, we often think in terms of trying to help our clients achieve so-called aha moments. Dan, can you share a couple of stories of some aha moment that maybe you've led people through?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So there's a few of my clients have been very public about their their journeys with it. So I'll focus on those ones. But so one example would be someone who was a vice president at an organization, wanted to stay in that organization, grow as an executive there. Came in basically, how do I succeed in this vice president role? And through our work together, he realized that actually, you know what, I'm not wanting to be with this organization. I want to be on my own. I want to do this bigger and better entrepreneurial venture. And it's been really great to walk through that journey with him as he realized that. And then he's actually successfully launched this entrepreneurial venture now, which is very exciting. Another one is has been working with someone who was I think an intern or just after an intern when I started with her. So a very early career person, and she's grown and is now a manager, and she has people reporting to her, and she's doing all this wonderful, great work. So she's like staying in an organization and succeeding in it. And then I've had other people who have come in looking to leave, looking to go elsewhere, going in like very much in a career coaching mindset. And I do both leadership and career, but this was very much like, okay, I'm looking to go elsewhere. And through looking at what they wanted to accomplish and the impact they wanted to make, they realized they could do it within their current organization. And they actually got a promotion through it and have been able to implement it a lot there. So it really is this, you said aha moments. I tend to go on the looking toward like insight of how am I viewing the world? What is my mindset? What do I really want? And how can I get there and achieve that? And coaching is such a great modality for that.
Yeah, I agree. And the whole career progression, I think, is an interesting space. And it's something arguably everybody that's in the work world has some sensitivity to. Most people agree that they don't want to take a job and that becomes their final resting place. They want to search for opportunity and advancement and growth, and those are a lot of the values that are coming to the front now. So you kind of inevitably, when you are working with various professionals in their situation, even if it is focused on leadership development, you inevitably get to that career change opportunity somewhere along the way. I tell an aha moment with a client I had a number of years ago. He was a pretty successful middle manager in a company, and there was an opening at the vice president level at his firm. And he had been encouraged to apply for it, even though he was arguably the youngest candidate that would have been doing so. But we worked together and came up with a strategy. I told him about the idea of developing a 100-day plan, projecting the assumption that he's in the role, what's he going to do the first 100 days, and take that information with him to the interview process, which he did. He worked really hard putting the plan together. He knew enough about the company and the department and the role that he would fill that he could speak to it intelligently. And the interview process included sitting down with the COO. And this is a publicly traded company, so it's a pretty high-level screening process. As he was talking to the COO, he presented his 100-day plan, and he had charts and graphs and a roadmap and everything. And the COO said, "Oh my God, pick all that up, come with me." And they went next door to the CEO's office. And the COO said to the CEO, he said, "Look at this, we found our guy. He's got all the stuff you and I have been talking about."
Amazing.
And they laid everything out. And, within a matter of days, he was the newly elected VP of this company. And he came back to me and said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't think I would have been able to tell that story if I hadn't done the prep work and the thought process to put all that together." So and talk about a career enhancing opportunity, a little forward thinking and preparation was the very tool that he needed to push it over the goal line and definitely differentiate himself from the competition.
It's a great story, and yeah, such a testament to how coaching can work in that space. I think it is really about that giving strategic thought to what you're thinking of doing and approaching it in that way. And I mean, so much of our culture and society is just either, more is always good. I want to do the most I can possibly do, take on every single leadership opportunity that comes up, and that's going to be the way to success and happiness. And that might not be the case for everyone. It might be the case for a particular person, or it's that, I'm going to try to do as little as possible. And I think it's really figuring out, like, what do you want to do and how can we best position you to get there. And that's
Right.
just so powerful with coaching.
Well, and I think underpinning all of that is a principle that a guest on my show earlier this year reminded me about. Is the idea when you show up either as a leader or an employee, there's a basic contract that exists. And in fundamental contract terms, both parties need to come to the table with expectations, which is usually what everybody talks about, and that's always top of mind. But they also need to bring their sense of obligation. And the expectation part is, if you're the employee, I want a fair pay, I want a chance of advancement, I want training, I want growth, I want opportunities, so on and so on and so on. And that's where everybody kind of stops the discussion. And then the employer is sitting there going, well, I have expectations too. You need to be on time, you need to do this, da 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 da. And that's where the whole friction kicks in. But in the traditional way of doing it like that, nobody has laid out obligations. Okay, you want all of that as the employee. Well, I'm curious, what do you think you're going to bring to the table? Let's go back to contract law, basic contract law. What are you bringing to the table? And then the employee might be inclined to say, fair question. I will show up on time. I will produce my work. I will go to training. I will pay attention. I will follow procedures, so on and so on and so on. Now, all of a sudden, you've got almost the perfect inverse connection where the employer's expectations fit the employee's obligations and vice versa. The employer's obligations can look like, I will give you fair pay, you will have opportunity for advancement, you'll get promoted, you can and will grow in your career, so on and so on. And now all of a sudden you've got a good arrangement that is a win-win for both parties. Everybody's happy. Now go get the work done.
Yeah, I think that's the sweet spot there, is when those can meet and align. And I think it's so much more of a two-way street than it ever has been now. And people are much less likely to rely on, this big mega company to be their employer for 45 years and then retire with the gold watch and everything now. And I think that's obviously true, that you can't be putting all your eggs in one basket and expecting a company to automatically take care of you. But alternatively, I think there's that value exchange, and when it is right, there's some really great opportunities with companies, and that's how you can keep people and engage them for the long term. So yeah, getting that alignment there is key.
Well, and if you think about it, if you have that healthy discussion up front and you, in effect, negotiate a little bit for understanding and alignment, then once the work begins, the idea of needing to have accountability and responsibility for both sides of what's going on, those discussions become much easier to have, because it's easy for the employer to go to the employee and say, remember what we talked about right at the start? I'm seeing a gap here. I'm seeing an opportunity for more, and let's talk about that. And therefore, it's not when those discussions happen, and they're inevitable, they will happen. It's not so random and seemingly out of the clear blue, and somebody is not getting surprised by the need to have that accountability talk.
I think that's right, and being genuine from each side, I think, is really critical in that. There's so much dishonesty and unfair dealing, I think, coming from both employers and employees a lot of the time, and just being able to have that really honest, upfront conversation, like you've mentioned, is key to having a successful working relationship, when you're both understanding both what the other person wants out of it, but also what they can contribute to it, and being able to hold each other accountable. I think you're spot on all this.
Well, let me shift gears just a little bit, and let me ask you this. In respect to the clients you work with and the companies you serve, what is the dialogue about trust? Trust is another one of those magic words that, if you're playing your buzzword bingo, that's become a popular theme to talk about. And I don't want to make light of it. I wrote a whole book about it, so I'm a big fan, and I'm very committed to helping leaders understand building trust. But let me ask you, Dan, what are you running into with discussions about how to create that psychological safety, trust kind of environment?
Yeah, I think you're just right on with this, and I think psychological safety is so crucial. And both sides of psychological safety, I think people forget what it really means a lot of the time, and it's that the environment of feeling like you can speak out without retribution, and you can share your ideas, but also that challenging element to it, where you're able to actually say something that is challenging and receive challenging feedback as well. In my mind, it really comes down to knowing when you're working with people who are square dealers, when you're working with people who are genuine, and expecting the best, but not being blindsided by either a leader or an organization or an employee who is not actually going to follow through on their end of that. So a lot of what I'll work with clients is, how can you grow in your current role, and how can you seek that next promotion and grow in this organization? A lot of times it will come out that something is happening, something is shaken in the organization, and if they haven't already done all of that work to prepare their networks and prepare to look elsewhere for roles, that they can really get pigeonholed and blindsided into something. So I think it's that basically being part of a common cause for as long as it makes sense, and as long as both sides are contributing, getting something out of it, but being prepared to walk away if it's going in a different direction and you don't feel that it's resolvable, or have those difficult conversations from both the employer side is key there. So it's a two-way street on trust.
Well, I agree. And I think as the business world navigates the current state of uncertainty, both from economic pressures and global pressures that are emerging right now, and as we're having this discussion, and it'll be a few more weeks before we go live, there's still some untold developments in the economic front. A lot of the leaders I'm working with today share the burden of, if they're kind of in the middle of the organization, middle to upper parts of the organization, there are strategic discussions happening about perhaps downsizing, repositioning, even maybe spinning off departments and units. And those are all understandable business decisions, but then they have to turn around and they have to go talk to their teams. And their teams are hearing the jungle drums banging about, possibilities, and the rumor mill is active. So the leader is kind of caught in the middle. It's like, there are things I'm talking about that I'm not ready to tell you yet. And I don't want to be insincere or disingenuous, but there's some stuff you just don't need to know right now. Because the truth is, we don't know where that's really going to go. Yes, we're having a discussion, but no, we haven't reached a decision. when the time comes, the decision may be 180 degrees opposite of what all the dominoes would suggest. So there's no point in getting spun up and frustrated about tomorrow. It's just reality of modern business. So it is a conundrum that current leaders are carrying the burden of right now. And again, I don't want to make light of who's responsible for what, but it is a reality, and good, well-meaning leaders are very sensitive to not liking being put in that situation, but they know it comes with the territory and they're dealing with it accordingly.
Yeah, it's a perennial issue with I think there's a sort of naive view that good leadership now is just being fully transparent about every single decision, and a lot of the burden of leadership is in carrying that, is in exactly like you said, not sharing every single development when it's not an appropriate time. And it's a lot of that making hard decisions that are for the benefit of the organization. I think it's doing that in a way that's not flippant, in a way that makes people feel valued and like they're being treated fairly and honestly. And I think as long as you can do that as a leader, it's really hard to do, obviously, and it's something that you have to carry. But I think that's all you can expect as a leader. I do think that there's also a burden on leaders to not just automatically do the easy thing to, juice the bottom line or pad their own pockets or whatever that is too, of looking at people as more than lines on a spreadsheet. And as soon as there's $1 to be made by cutting this person, we're going to do a layoff. So I think there's also that element of it. And from the employee side too, there's, do you trust that your organization is really caring about you as an employee at the same time as they're trying to meet their business objectives? And it's all a matter of really feeling comfortable that everyone is doing their best to balance all of these competing perspectives. And if something is way out of whack on any line, of making sure that you have alternatives too.
Well, and maybe along that line, one last question, Dan, back to the generational migration of things. As the boomers roll out and retire or liquidate, and the Xers, maybe even themselves, start to slowly make their own transitions, do you have a sense of what the real prevailing theme is? What do the millennials want to see changed right now?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. I think it's coming at a good time where some of these previous generations have actually set up a lot of this shift away from this old school industrial era kind of leadership, the management that we talked about before, being the prevailing theme, to, as we move into this increasingly volatile world with a lot of change, there's a lot of opportunity to do new things, to innovate, to create. For millennials, if I had to pick one unifying theme, they're very purpose driven. So I think there's a purpose drive across generations. There's Dan Pink's book on, mastery, autonomy, and purpose being drivers for humans in general. I think for millennials, that purpose drive is really there. So for current executives looking for how to really engage and partner with and develop millennials, the more that your organization can be genuinely serving a higher purpose, even if it is in a traditional business, but doing something that goes beyond making widgets and trying to just maximize the output and the profits from those, but doing something that has a broader societal good or a broader purpose to it, is a great way to really attract and engage the millennials.
I love it. Well, thank you, Dan. If folks want to know more about you and your work, your book and everything, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Doug. So my coaching practice is called Contempus Leadership. So if they go to contempusleadership.com, they can learn more about working with me in that capacity. And then the book is called The Career Design Map. So that's available at Amazon. It's available through order at bookstores, and they can go to careerdesignmap.com or even careerdesignquiz.com. There's a free quiz that goes along with it too.
Great. Well, Dan, one last time, thank you for sitting in. I think this has been a great one, and I really appreciate your insight and your commentary on these things.
Thanks again. I really enjoyed the discussion, Doug.
All right, man. Well, folks, with that, we're going to bring this to a close. As always, I want to remind you we do have a video version of this over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Hop over there, give us a comment, feedback, like, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever. Would love to hear from you. And I do want to ask if you or someone you know might be a good guest for the show. Just drop me a line at dougthorpe.com. Let me know your suggestions and ideas. Would love to hear from you. For now, we're going to sign off. Go out there and make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.